Picture a room with no windows, somewhere in the Roman world, before the year 70. Inside are believers who love Jesus and who are quietly calculating an exit. Not an emotional one, a legal one, because staying is starting to cost them their families, their income, their standing in their own community, and walking back to the world they grew up in is safer, more familiar, and sitting right there waiting for them. So someone sits down to write a letter with one purpose: stop them from leaving. What could possibly talk a person out of the safe option using nothing but words on a page? The answer hinges on a single word repeated so often it becomes impossible to ignore. And once you see how many times it's used and exactly what it's aimed at, you will not read this letter the same way again. This is the book of Hebrews, and the question we're spending the next few minutes answering is this: why does one repeated word manage to make the safe, familiar choice look like the worst deal? Here's what you need going in. The people receiving this letter were Jewish believers in Jesus, likely living somewhere in the diaspora, probably before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70. Though the exact date and location are still debated among scholars. We can't nail down every detail with certainty, but the pressure the letter describes is specific enough to point to a real community. They weren't confused about who Jesus was, and their problem wasn't doctrine, it was cost. Later in the letter, the author reminds them they'd already had property taken from them for their faith and took it joyfully, which tells you this wasn't a hypothetical threat. It was something they'd already lived through once. Meanwhile, walking back toward the synagogue world they'd grown up in was in most Roman settings socially safer and far more recognizable than staying openly identified with this new, still controversial movement. And it came with a community these believers already had blood ties to. Following Jesus was the harder, costlier, newer path, and every synagogue door these believers walked past was a door they could still walk back through without anyone stopping them. Whoever wrote this letter wasn't writing a devotional for private reflection. He was writing to stop a specific group of people in a specific place from making one specific decision. And he had, at most, a few chapters of parchment to do it in. To do it, he reaches for a Jewish light to heavy style of reasoning, later formalized in rabbinic tradition under the name Kal Vachomer. If something holds true in a smaller, lesser case, it holds even more true in the larger one. And he builds that argument around a single Greek word: Kriton. Standard Greek lexicons trace it back to a root meaning strength, and its normal range runs from stronger to more excellent to superior. It's not a word for nicer or more pleasant. Every time this author reaches for it, he isn't offering a compliment. He's putting two things on a scale and declaring which one outweighs the other. And he's about to run every pillar the Old Covenant sacrificial system stood on through that same test, one at a time, until nothing is left standing on the other side of the scale. Watch how it opens. Chapter 1 compares Jesus to angels, and that comparison mattered more than it might sound like today. In first-century Jewish thought, angels weren't background characters. They were understood as the beings who delivered the law to Moses at Sinai. If you wanted the single greatest authority available to argue Jesus should be measured against, angels were it. Here's what makes that strange. The author doesn't downplay them. He states the case plainly, quoting a string of Old Testament passages to land the verdict early. Jesus, he writes, has become so much better than the angels. That's a legal claim dressed as a compliment, made in the letter's very first chapter, and it means the highest bar available in Jewish angelology has already been cleared before the letter is a page old. That's a fact worth sitting with on its own. The opening argument of the New Testament's most tightly reasoned letter is that Jesus outranks the very beings Jewish tradition credited with handing down the Ten Commandments in the first place. But here's the thing, the author doesn't let the comparison stay comfortable. Chapter 2 turns and asks the reader directly what happens if they walk away anyway. If the message angels delivered mattered enough that ignoring it brought real consequences under the old law, he asks, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation delivered by someone greater than angels? That's not abstract theology. That's the writer looking his actual audience in the eye and asking what their plan is if they walk back through that door. Then in chapter 3, the target shifts to someone far more personal for this audience: Moses. Moses wasn't a side character in Judaism. He was the covenant mediator, the servant through whom this entire system of law and worship had first been delivered to Israel, and the figure these readers were being pulled back toward. The author doesn't insult him. He calls Moses faithful in all his house. But then he draws the line precisely. Moses was faithful as a servant inside the house. Jesus, the argument goes, holds the higher honor of a son set over that same house. Same word, faithful, doing the same work but pointed at two very different roles. And it's right here, almost in passing, that the letter introduces its second keyword, one that will end up doing just as much work as better faith. Pistis, because immediately after the Moses comparison, the author pivots to Israel's failure in the wilderness, an entire generation that heard God's promise and still never entered the rest he offered them. And the reason given isn't laziness or bad luck. It's unbelief, a failure of pistis. Hold on to that word, because it isn't finished doing its job yet. Right now it just means trusting what you've heard. By the time this letter reaches chapter 11, it's going to mean something heavier. Something closer to staying loyal to a promise you may never live to see kept. That's still ahead. For now, notice this. Better is the word doing the measuring, weighing Christ against everything the Old Covenant's sacrificial system offered. Faith is the word aimed at the reader, telling them what to do once the measuring is done. The author braids these two words together for the rest of the letter. And once you know to listen for them, you can hear the whole argument being built out of just those two threads. If you're starting to notice a pattern where every pillar of the Old Covenant system gets weighed and comes up lighter, you're reading this letter exactly the way it was built to be read. And if that's already reframing something you thought you understood, this is a good place to hit subscribe, because the argument is about to get a lot more personal. We're only 4 chapters in. Chapters 5 through 7 take on the priesthood, arguably the most sacred office in all of Judaism, the office that mediated sacrifice, atonement, and access to the sanctuary itself. And here the author makes an unusual move. Instead of comparing Jesus to the priests actively serving in the Jerusalem temple, he reaches back to an obscure figure from Genesis 14. A king named Melchizedek, who blesses Abraham, receives a tithe from him, and then vanishes from the text entirely with no recorded birth, death, or family line given. Now here's where this gets interesting. The author treats that silence itself as an argument. Melchizedek's priesthood, he points out, existed before Levi's family line was even born, which means, by the logic of this letter, it outranks the priesthood that came after it. Think of it the way a legal claim to property works. If an older deed to a piece of land was never dissolved, a newer deed drawn up generations later doesn't erase it. It simply sits underneath a prior claim that's still technically valid. That's the shape of the author's argument. Abraham, ancestor of every priest who had ever come from the tribe of Levi, paid tithes to Melchizedek. And since Levi was, in the author's words, still in the loins of his father when that happened, Levi himself, through his own ancestor, effectively paid tribute to a priesthood older than his own. Here's the one-sentence version worth remembering. The priesthood these readers had trusted their entire lives to give them access to God had, according to this letter,
already been outranked by another priest 2,000 years before their own priesthood even existed.
If Hebrews is starting to feel less like a maze and more like a case being built, stay with me, because the argument is about to move from priesthood to covenant itself. Chapters 8 through 10 push the argument to its heaviest point yet: a better covenant, a better sanctuary, and finally a better sacrifice, one offered, once the author says, instead of an animal sacrifice repeated endlessly year after year. Precisely because those repeated sacrifices, in his own words, could never actually take away sin. That sounds simple until you notice where the author goes next to prove it, because he doesn't just assert a new covenant exists. He reaches back roughly 650 years, quoting the prophet Jeremiah's promise that God would one day write his law on people's hearts instead of on stone tablets. The argument is that this promise was never meant to upgrade the Old Covenant. It was written to replace it. And the author draws the conclusion himself. If Scripture calls something new, he writes, that makes the first one ready to vanish away. It's worth pausing on a real point of disagreement here, because good scholarship doesn't pretend this part is settled. Most scholars agree the letter treats the Old Covenant as functionally finished. Where they disagree is on the mechanism. Some point to the temple's destruction in the year 70 as the historical event that made the temple's sacrificial rituals physically impossible to continue.
While others argue the author's theological case stands entirely on its own, independent of anything that happened to the building in Jerusalem.
Either way, the writer isn't quietly building a bridge between two systems for his readers to walk across at their own pace. He's telling them the old one already has an expiration date stamped on it, and Scripture itself announced it centuries in advance. Every thread the letter has built so far, angels, Moses, priesthood, covenant, sacrifice, collides at the start of chapter 11, right after chapter 10 closes with a warning not to shrink back. And here the author finally defines the word he's been building toward the entire time. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, he writes, and then adds a phrase worth remembering on its own. The evidence of things not seen. Then, instead of arguing the point further, he proves it with a list: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Rahab, and more, each one introduced with the same two words: by faith. Person after person who staked everything on a promise they never lived to see fully arrive. Here's the detail worth pausing on. Almost every name on that list died still waiting. Enoch is the one clear exception, taken up without ever facing death at all. And later in the chapter, some of these same people are described winning battles, escaping the sword, even getting loved ones back from death, real, in-history victories. But the chapter's own closing verdict cuts through all of it. None of them, the text says, received the one promise the whole list was actually about, which means the writer's real claim was never that faith gets you the reward now. It's that faith means staying loyal to a promise that can outlive you. Say that out loud with no other context, and it still lands. Faith in this book isn't certainty about the present. It's loyalty to a future you might not live to see completed. Think about the image the author reaches for right after that list, because it's the one built to hold the entire argument together. Chapter 12 pictures a Roman stadium. The kind these readers would have known well, tiered stone seating rising on every side, and calls that list from chapter 11 a great cloud of witnesses. The word doesn't necessarily mean spectators leaning over a rail to watch the race in this letter's own vocabulary. A witness is someone who has testified, the way every name in chapter 11 already testified through what their faith actually cost them. So picture it less like a crowd cheering a game, and less like an audience watching you personally, and more like their finished lives ringing the track as evidence already entered. Proof on the record. That faith holds up before the reward ever arrives. And the instruction that follows is to run with patience, eyes fixed, not on the crowd but on Jesus. Described as the one who endured the cross for the joy set before him. The same logic that's been running underneath this entire letter from chapter 1 onward. Something better was always worth enduring something hard to reach. If all of this holds, if Hebrews really is built to argue that Christ isn't a slight upgrade on the Old Covenant, but a different category of claim entirely, it changes how you read a letter you might have skimmed past as dense or repetitive. It means the faith this book describes was never meant to be a passive feeling. It's the specific decision to keep moving when the reward you were promised hasn't shown up yet, which is exactly the decision its first readers were being pressured to make in real time. It means the comparisons to angels, Moses, and the priesthood weren't academic theology exercises. They were the author meeting his readers precisely where their temptation was strongest, and closing that door one argument at a time. And it means that when this letter calls Jesus better than angels or greater than Moses, it isn't reaching for a compliment at all. It's applying the same weighing test to your own life that it applied to theirs. Asking whether whatever you'd be tempted to trade your faith for actually holds up once you put it on the scale. It means the Melchizedek argument in chapters 5 through 7 wasn't a strange detour into an obscure Old Testament figure. It was the author establishing with the driest possible legal reasoning that the priesthood his readers were tempted to run back to had never actually held the highest claim in the first place. It means the list of names in chapter 11 wasn't included for inspiration. It was submitted as evidence, the way a lawyer submits exhibits in a case he's been building since the letter's first line. This is where the usual explanation for this book starts to break down. Treating it as a loose collection of sermons misses that it's a single sustained argument with a verdict at the end. And it means the warnings scattered through the letter, by most counts 5 separate ones, weren't scare tactics. They were the natural conclusion of an argument that had just spent 10 chapters proving there was nothing better left to go back to. One more thing worth knowing before we close. Nobody actually knows who wrote this letter. Paul's name got attached to it early in church history. But the vocabulary, sentence structure, and argument style look different enough from Paul's other letters that scholars, ancient and modern, have doubted the attribution for centuries. Origen, one of the most respected scholars in the early church, is often quoted as saying that only God truly knows who wrote Hebrews, which means the most tightly argued case for staying faithful under pressure anywhere in the New Testament was written by someone whose own name didn't survive the story he was trying to save other people from walking out of. So go back to that room with no windows, and the believers deciding whether staying was worth what it was costing them. They never got a signature at the bottom of that letter. What they got instead was 13 chapters building one comparison at a time, proving that whatever they thought they'd be walking back to was never actually the better option, and a list of names in the stands, cheering them toward a finish line. Most of those names never lived to see themselves. That's not a compliment running through this letter. That's a verdict, delivered chapter after chapter until there's nowhere left to retreat to. If this changed how you'll read Hebrews next time you open it, send it to someone who's quietly weighing whether their faith is worth what it's currently costing them. And tell us in the comments which comparison hit hardest for you: angels, Moses, or the priesthood. Subscribe if you want the next one, because there's another book in this series built around a single word doing exactly this much work.